you salty sailors, time to raise anchor and set sail for your best scrawny life. Arr!
If it keeps on raining, the levee is going to break. Let me say again. If it keeps on raining, the levee is going to break, and when the levee breaks, we will have no place to stay.
There it is. That's why we wear the gloves. No harm done.
Well, it's been a rainy summer. The drought, I guess, is over now. In spite of the rain, they've held the level of Lake Red Rock down around the 742 mark. I don't know if that had to do with the bridge construction or just what, but finally the level has been allowed to rise a little bit. It's come up about 8 feet. And as such, the thing is though, normally when it floods, it does so in the spring rather than in August. And so there's less plant growth, and a lot of times the level actually rises faster and is allowed to rise higher. So there's more water, less plants. In this case, it's not risen that much, and the plants are all fully grown and everything. It's the middle of summer. So the water has developed this dark tea kind of stain to it, and that's really limited the visibility. So that's why everything's happening at really close range. The visibility is really bad. The water just sort of looks, with the clouds and that tea stain, kind of just looks like a black mirror. The fish, you can't see until you're right on top of them. So it wasn't spectacular like some of my other gar fishing videos, but yeah, we got out there and got some action. A little flood whining here. Now a lot of this is taking place where Highway 14 crosses the White Breast Creek arm, and there were definitely larger fish in the creek itself. I went up the creek a little ways. There were some larger fish, but the creek was muddy, and then on top of that tea stain, the visibility was just very, very low. And the bigger fish would appear for just a second, but before I could get a cast off, they'd disappear again, and I just couldn't make it happen in the creek. So a lot of these are smaller fish that were in the surrounding swamps. And with these small gar, they're one of those fish that, if the fish shakes free of the hook, it's really not that bad of an outcome. If you get a good jump out of it, and then it spits the hook, well, you've basically got what you came for. The unhooking part here, as you can see, is just kind of a lot of not necessary gar wrangling, and that's the danger part of it is the unhooking. So, and that's also why I don't use those lures made of frayed nylon rope. Well, first of all, to be thick enough to entangle a gar's teeth, especially a short-nosed gar, which is kind of different than the long-nosed gar. To be thick enough that you're carrying a lot of water on your back cast. So it's sort of like it slows down your fly casting and limits your distance. Now in this case, my distance was limited by the visibility anyway, but in a normal scenario, that high amount of water that's absorbed by that nylon rope, it's kind of like casting a wet sock, rather than, the fly I have is just a plastic tube and a few feathers and stuff, so it casts a long ways really easily. But the other reason why I don't use those nylon rope type flies or lures is that to get your lure back, you're going to need to unentangle it from the gar's teeth, and greatly increasing your chances of being bitten. Now, as I always like to point out, gar are native fish to the United States. They have been here since the Ice Age, since the end of the Ice Age, and they do play a role in controlling the populations of invasive fish, such as carp, because the carp spawn in these swamp areas that gar later inhabit, and they become, the hatchlings become food for gar. Gar are not out in your favorite lake eating largemouth bass. They're eating carp and shad and creatures that live in the shallow margins of the lake. Now, they're no good to eat, but if you're fishing strictly for sport, they're a great sporting fish, especially if you can find a big one. But even the small ones put up a great fight, jump a couple times, and I've missed a couple of the good jumps, even with my head-mounted camera. Like a few of the jumps escaped being filmed, but all the same, it's always an exciting trip if you find some gar, and if you're fishing purely for sport, they're a pretty good sporting fish, especially for the middle of summer when some of the other fish have moved into like a nighttime feeding mode and drop down below thermoclines and so forth. Gar will still always be right there on the surface with the shad. And handling them safely really just amounts to some common sense measures. Just grabbing the fish right behind the head, holding on firmly, using pinching down the barbs in the fly that I use, and wearing those leather gloves and so forth. Basically have kept me safe through many years of gar fishing. Their teeth, of course, they're needle-like teeth. They're thin, they're long, thin, and brittle, rather than being wide and knife-edged like a pike's tooth. So their teeth, if you are bitten, their teeth can break off and embed in your skin. So you really don't want that. So the important thing is just to avoid being bitten. And using the type of fly that I use, and using these techniques and so forth, you can pretty well avoid that. Now, fishing from a boat, it sort of increases, especially a kayak, sort of increases the danger level a bit. Here you noticed, as I brought that fish aboard, it did swing around and just barely grazed my leg with a tooth, and it did draw a little blood, but not a serious gash, no teeth broke off or anything. Now, what happened was I was sitting not in the seat of the kayak, but for better visibility, I was sitting on the backrest behind the seat. I was sitting a few inches higher so I could see better. And that meant that I couldn't lay the gar on the front deck of the kayak like I normally do, like you've seen in other videos, but I had to lay it down inside the kayak, which sort of brought it a little closer to my legs and so forth. So a little lapse in safety procedure there. Nice updraft we got going on here. That'll probably bring us some more rain. But anyway, a little lapse in safety procedure there. So that's one thing to not do. For these smaller fish, there's no need to even bring them inside the boat. I'm just sort of pinning them against the side of the boat with one arm and then unhooking them with the other. So, like this one will unhook without even bringing it inside the boat.
That's why we wear the gloves and pinch down those barbs. No harm done there. Yeah, the old rain looks like it's moving through here.
The following weekend, some friends and I went out to try for gar again, but that tea stain was even worse and you couldn't really see anything. So to salvage the trip, we went up to Whitebreast Point. There you can see that mud line. There was a mud line sort of wrapping around the point. We did harass the sailboat traffic a little bit, but afterward we settled down to a nice round of catfishing, and we got several nice ones. But we released those, but I kept 2 nice drum, and with those drum, I made a blackened drum sandwich, similar to the blackened catfish sandwich that I'd made before. Now, I didn't have that Nepali chili lime pickle that I had the last time, but I did use some pepperoncini, and it turned out pretty much just as good. Now, filleting these fish, this is my second favorite fish to eat, second next to walleye, so none of this fish will really go to waste. The cutting board was sort of, it had a lip that sort of, I wasn't doing a good job filleting there because of the lip on that cutting board, but I'll use the bones and the heads and everything, even the riblets, for various uses. So yeah, none of that fish will go to waste. But in this case, for this blackening technique, we're just using the fillets. You just want just a tablespoon of oil, and you want to get it smoking hot, almost ready to burst into flames. That's why it's good to do this technique outdoors. Otherwise, you really smoke up your kitchen. But there you can see it's almost ready to go on fire, and that's when we're putting in the fillets. And here you can see that rib meat. I wasn't lying when I said none of it will go to waste. There's some chunks of that rib meat going in. But the sandwich we're making with the fillets, though, you can get a boneless fillet from a drum. Just start with that hump that's kind of behind the head, and make a slice down to the anal vent, and then basically fillet the back half of that. You should pretty well avoid, there's a few pin bones in the head area, you should avoid them by using that technique. You can always add a bit more oil if it goes completely dry, but keep the amount small. So our sandwich is just onion, green pepper, blackened fish fillet, little mayo, and some pepperoncini, and boy did it turn out good. It was really, really good. That's something you definitely want to try for yourself.